Hello, and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 585, The All-Seeing Eye, Part 2. We left off last week with a discussion of conspiracy, conspiracism, and the difference between the two. And because it's going to be very important for us this week, I want to take a moment to return to Under the Eye of Power and the way it frames conspiracy as central to the history of the United States, because we'll see, I think, that this analysis applies in many ways to Japan as well. Indeed, that's kind of the point of this whole miniseries. For a quick reminder, because it's been a week since we've talked about this, unless you are one of the folks who binges a whole miniseries once it's done, in which case I'm very sorry about all of the super long ones for the last few months, conspiracism is, according to author Colin Dickey, more or less fundamental to the history of American democracy. Conspiracism, in this rendering, is basically the belief that the world is comprehensible as a sort of invisible battle between unseen forces manipulating events to their own ends. To borrow the words of the political scientist Karl Popper, it is a mindset that emerges when you discard conventional notions of a world controlled by a god or the gods, and then put something else, the Illuminati, the Freemasons, the Lizard People, the World Trade Organization, whatever, in their place. Often wrapped up in this mindset is a concept that the world is divided into this dualistic battle between these controlling forces, which represent absolute evil, and the forces of good which oppose them, and that battle is foretold or understood in these symbolic ways that allow the careful observer, in other words, the conspiracist, to ferret out the nature of this battle and the nefarious plot by picking up on the ways in which the leaders of the evil side subtly betray their own intent. In America, we tend to associate that worldview with two specific moments in American history: the Salem witch trials in the 1690s and the McCarthy era or the Second Red Scare of the 1950s. And these are treated as aberrations, shameful but rare reminders of the dangers of paranoia run amok. But in his book Under the Eye of Power, author Colin Dickey makes the argument that in fact American politics has basically from the jump been animated by conspiracism, by a belief that the American system was constantly under threat either from external or internal subversion. To quote Dickey for a moment, quote, "Moral panics arise regularly, almost like clockwork, as a means to place certain elements of behavior and thought outside the bounds of acceptable American discourse. Hysterias about Satanists or Freemasons or the Jews are not spontaneous, irrational bursts of fear from an irrational and ignorant populist. They are almost always a carefully controlled and nurtured rhetorical tool to shift and shape what will and won't be considered American." What happened in Salem in 1692 is not a singular outlier. It was as American as apple pie. To believe in America is to believe, for many of us, in a nation that is always in a state of improving, that has its shortcomings and injustices, but seeks to build on the mistakes of the past and make a better world for future generations. We believe, in defiance of all available evidence, that the arc of history bends not only toward justice, but towards wisdom and clarity. Sometimes paranoia grips our nation, such thinking goes, but we not only think that such things are momentary blips, but also that once we've learned better, such beliefs will not appear again. American history suggests the exact opposite. It suggests that on a fundamental level, conspiracy theories involving secret groups and subversive forces have become inextricable from how we participate in democracy. Now, that was a long quote, and Dickey points to a host of evidence to support that position, noting first and foremost, and this will be on the test later, that the intellectual climate at the time of the founding of the United States predisposed people, not just on the fringe, but on the mainstream, to popularize conspiratorial notions around politics. For the more conservative elements of colonial American society, say you're a loyalist who is horrified by the advent of the American Revolution in the 1770s, or you're a conservative Republican who is terrified at the news of the radicalism of the French Revolution in the 1790s, well, you had to then have some sort of explanation for why what seems to you to be a perfectly natural and harmonious social order is falling apart. And of course, it's much easier to blame a conspiracy of outsiders for those things than it would be to engage in deep introspection about why not everyone feels the same way about the system that you do. Meanwhile, those in both European and American society who were on the intellectual cutting edge in the 1700s, adherents of the philosophical ideas of the European Enlightenment, were actually just as disposed to conspiratorial mindsets, at least from a certain point of view. After all, the whole point of the Enlightenment, of the intellectual movement, which was defined by huge figures like John Locke, Jean Jacques Rousseau, Voltaire, and so on, was that the world was rationally comprehensible, that human agency was the ultimate force in the universe, capable, with enough introspection, of understanding and shaping the world to our collective will. The notion, after all, that human history was the product of human action, and not, say, bigger systems that are more outside our control, remains a very powerful one down to our very day. And according to Dickey, this explains the proliferation of conspiracy theories in early American history. These are the reason why, even if you don't have a background in 1770s Enlightenment reading clubs in the Holy Roman Empire, you've probably heard of the Society of the Illuminati. Because conspiracies about this group, which was shut down by the Bavarian government basically as soon as it was founded, having secretly still survived and masterminded the French Revolution, were rampant in 1790s America, where paranoia that the Illuminati were going to bring the guillotine and French revolutionary radicalism to the US was everywhere. One of the biggest preachers of 1790s New England, Jedediah Morse, the father of the inventor of the telegraph and associated code, Samuel Morse, helped magnify those conspiracies by claiming on his pulpit that, quote, there is some secret plan in operation hostile to true liberty and religion, which requires to be aided by these vile slanders, the goal of which is to promote astonishing increase in irreligion. The pattern this panic set expressed itself over and over in American history, from anti-Catholic conspiracies promoted by the so-called Know-Nothings, who believed that the Vatican was out to subvert Protestant America, to conspiracies about foreign anarchists and communists in the late 19th and early 20th century, including one memorable instance during the first Red Scare, where U.S. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer predicted a planned revolution against the United States government in May of 1920, and used that as an excuse to crack down and deport radicals en masse. Of course, nothing happened, and Palmer's career was more or less ruined, but his second-in-command and student, the lawyer J. Edgar Hoover, was able to continue his political and law enforcement career unscathed. I could go on and on about this book, the clever way it presents America's history with conspiracy, but that's not what you're here for, I assume, and I do want to get to the Japan-related part of this, because you see, all the analysis we've talked about so far is about the context of conspiracism in the US, but I put it to you, and this is basically the thread that will carry us through the rest of the miniseries. We are done talking about US history, that much of the pattern of discourse that Colin Dickey is talking about in Under the Eye of Power applies not just to the United States, but to Japan too. So let's take a look at the way in which this kind of conspiracism has animated three specific moments in Japanese history over the next couple of weeks. Somewhat ironically, given that America's earliest conspiracy panics were about Illuminati masterminded plots to crush Christianity and spread godless Jacobinism around the world, our very first conspiratorial moment in Japanese history was driven by the fear of Christianity itself. So for a quick reminder, Christianity first arrived in Japan in 1542, when a Chinese trading ship carrying either 2 or 3 Portuguese sailors, accounts differ somewhat, and maneuvering along the coast of China was caught in a storm and driven off course before landing at the island of Tanegashima off the southern coast of Kyushu. Now, the Portuguese were in Asia for, well, a couple different reasons, but by this point, Portugal's maritime empire was about a century and a half old, having begun with the adventures of Prince Henry the Navigator and his voyages around the Atlantic coast of Africa. Prince Henry was desperately curious to know what lay beyond the bounds of the northern edge of the Sahara. At the time, from the European perspective, more or less where the Here There Be Dragons part of the map started, and in particular, whether or not it was possible to find a sea route by this method that would circumvent the Islamic controlled trading routes of the Middle East, the Silk Road in particular, and connect Europe directly with Asia and especially China. It took well past the lifetime of Prince Henry to actually manage this, but in 1513, Portuguese merchants did actually successfully make it to the southern coast of Ming Dynasty controlled China and the city of Guangzhou, or Canton. Things proved frosty at first, with the Portuguese resenting the extreme control of the Ming Dynasty emperors in far-off Beijing, who demanded absolute authority over trade within their land. At a few points, the Portuguese even ended up confronting China militarily and pretty much every time getting their butts roundly handed to them, because in the early 1500s, the Ming Dynasty was pretty indisputably the single greatest political power on the planet. It took a few decades, but eventually the bureaucrats of far-off Beijing decided that these strange barbarians could be of use and allowed them some trading privileges and a base in Macau off the southern coast, just in time for the Portuguese to open up trade with Japan. On the Japanese side, meanwhile, when the Portuguese first came to Kyushu, the island was divided between rival clans of samurai battling for supremacy, this being about 80-ish years into the turbulent civil wars of the so-called Sengoku Jidai, or era of warring states. Naturally enough, the rival warlords were more than happy to welcome Portuguese merchants into their territories, though not necessarily for the reasons you'd think. Portuguese weapons, and especially the arquebus, a type of early matchlock firearm, and of course cannons, were certainly welcome tools in the eternal human quest to find new and exciting ways to blow each other up. Very basic hand cannons based on Chinese models had come to Japan by at least the 1460s, but by the 1500s, European firearms were pulling ahead in the technological race thanks to three distinct innovations: metal bullets instead of stone, which were a more consistent weight and shape and thus a lot easier to aim, matchlocks with a finger trigger instead of having to manually insert a smoldering rope into the weapon, and stocks, which allowed for easier aiming using iron sights and using your shoulder to absorb recoil. These new matchlock weapons were, in a word, just a lot easier to use than Chinese hand cannons, and thus far more suited to calling up a giant mass of peasants to go vaguely off in that direction and shoot everything that moves. So these early arquebuses and the associated Portuguese recipe for gunpowder, which was a lot more potent than the Chinese variant, were of course quite popular. The Lord of Tanegashima supposedly bought the first arquebus from the Portuguese for the crazy sum of 200 golden ryo coins, and within months, no less than 3 separate sets of blacksmiths were working to reverse engineer the technology. All 3 would eventually succeed. And because of that, the real value of the Portuguese trade didn't come from guns. Again, reverse engineering those didn't take long. It came from the fact that the Portuguese, unlike Japanese merchants, could legally trade with China. China was, of course, the center of the Asian economy, and in many ways the world economy during this period. In Japan in particular, the demand for Chinese goods was always crazy high. High enough, in point of fact, that the carefully monitored volume of legal trade allowed by the rulers of the Ming Dynasty, all of them good Confucians, suspicious of the corrupting influence of trade and wealth, was never anywhere close enough to satisfy demand in Japan. This led to constant battles within the Japanese government over who got to control the small number of trade permits for voyages to China, battles that only got more intense as the political situation got less and less stable, and which culminated in 1523 when 2 separate trading missions from Japan arrived in Ningbo, each claiming to be the legitimate one for that year, and eventually coming to literal blows in the middle of one of China's biggest ports. In the aftermath, and frankly, pretty unsurprisingly, Japanese merchants were just wholesale banned from China. A small number of people labeled as pirates by the Ming Dynasty, largely just black marketeers and smugglers, though a few actual pirates too, did continue to funnel Chinese goods into Japan because high demand plus low supply equals jackpot, but there were just never enough of them willing to risk it to come anywhere close to meeting demand. But now we have the Portuguese, who have legal trade permission in China and could just bring whatever there was demand for into Japan. This meant, of course, the Portuguese could make a lot of money as middlemen, and the Portuguese trade could be an enormous source of wealth for any feudal lord in Japan who was able to convince Portuguese ships to come to his ports. Enter now the missionaries of the Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuit Order, whose members quickly followed on the heels of Portuguese voyages of exploration with their charge to spread the gospel of Roman Catholic Christianity all around the world. At this point, the Jesuit order was a relative newcomer to the complicated world of Catholic politics, founded in 1539 by the soldier-turned-priest Ignatius Loyola. Now, the Jesuit order is an important part of global history for a few different reasons. Loyola's vision of a new monastic order that would operate in a regimented, top-down fashion, inspired by his military career, was driven in large part by his sense of the urgent necessity of combating the rising tide of heresy in Europe, specifically, of course, the heresy of Protestantism. Jesuit priests would also be at the forefront of European Catholic voyages of exploration. The order emphasized education and scholarship both for their own sakes and because knowledge of the world, including so-called heathen lands, would help spread the order and assist Catholic powers in missionizing. As a result, Jesuits have this very interesting history during this period, from helping to manage some of the earliest European trade networks in the Americas to spearheading Portugal's relations with the courts of the Ming emperors. And given how closely the order tended to follow Portuguese voyages of exploration, it didn't take long for word to come back to Jesuit bases in the rest of Asia about this new land of Japan. Now, we did a whole long thing on the role the Jesuits played in the Portuguese trade with Japan, on how they parlayed that into winning new converts, and how they eventually used it to win the ultimate concession, direct control of a small trading post on a peninsula in western Kyushu that previously had just been a few dinky fishing villages, but which became the great city of Nagasaki. We're not going to go back through all of that. I don't think it's directly necessary for understanding what comes next, but if you want more detail, I did a whole mini-series on Nagasaki and the so-called Christian century in Japan, starting with episode 422. I do want to go back over a little bit of that using the rest of this episode because I think it's helpful for setting up what comes next, which we're going to talk more about next week. Anyway, the upshot of all of this is that Jesuit missionaries in Japan first enjoyed, honestly, only pretty limited success. No less a presence than St. Francis Xavier, who, as the whole saint thing probably clues you into, is pretty important in the history of the order, had a decidedly mixed track record in his attempts to spread the good word in Japan. It wasn't until 1561 that another Jesuit missionary, Luis de Almeida, hit on the winning formula for finding converts in Japan. You see, Portuguese merchants, though their wares were very popular, were not very good at fitting in with the locals, and a few cultural miscommunications had turned into fatal brawls that led said Portuguese merchants concerned about their ability to keep doing business in Japan. The Portuguese trade was generally confined to one massive ship called a nao, or carrack. The Japanese called them kurobune, or black ships, after the tar used to waterproof them, and de Almeida suggested that he could find a safe and welcoming port for the Portuguese if they just followed his instructions on where to go in the future. His thinking was simple. He could go around holding the carrot of next year's nao and all the trade wealth it presented to eager local daimyo, feudal lords, and start a bidding war over the privilege of their port hosting that year's trade mission. In return, he would demand concessions, the most important one being the right to missionize and maybe even a chance to convert whichever daimyo was that desperate for the Portuguese trade. This worked like a charm. One lord, Omura Sumitada of western Kyushu, took the bait handily, gave de Almeida everything he wanted, and was the one to sign over what became Nagasaki to the Jesuits as a permanent port of harbor for the Portuguese trade. The result was that within a few decades, Nagasaki had become a massively wealthy trading port, Omura had become one of the most influential lords in Japan, and the Jesuits of Kyushu had become firmly embedded as middlemen between the Portuguese merchants and the locals. Thanks to their missionizing rights, they'd also been able to convert big swaths of the populace. With Omura's domain and Nagasaki as a base, Jesuits were able to convert a big chunk of Japan's population to Christianity. By 1600, at least 300,000 people were recorded as having been baptized, and 13 other feudal lords, daimyo, had seen enough of an advantage in the new religion to join Omura Sumitada in converting. But then, almost as quickly as it emerged, the facade of Christian power in Japan collapsed. It took 39 years from the first Jesuit contacts with that Lord Omura Sumitada in 1561 to the high water mark of Christianity in Japan in 1600. But if you wind ahead the clock 39 more years, the Christian faith in Japan will be outlawed, its adherents will largely be wiped out, and the few remainders will have been forced into hiding. So how'd that happen? Well, the reasons are complicated, but for one thing, the position of the Christian faith in Japan was not as strong as it appeared from the outside. 300,000 converts during this period sounds like a lot, yes, but keep in mind that, well, population estimates during this period are challenging because of wonky and uneven recording. The lowball estimate for Japan's overall population in 1600 was 17 million people, which would mean that Christians represented 0.018% of Japan's population. And again, that's using the lowball estimate for the national population. Admittedly, much of the converted population was concentrated in Kyushu and not spread evenly throughout the country, but even so, Christianity was certainly big for a fairly new religion, but it was not massive. For another thing, we have some reason to doubt the full sincerity of some of those recorded conversions. People converting to a new religion for personal benefit is nothing new. The parents of Luis de Almeida, the Jesuit friar who'd come up with the whole trade in exchange for missionary privileges plan in the first place, well, they were what are called new Christians. In other words, Jews who had converted to escape being tortured to death by the Spanish Inquisition. In Japan specifically, quite a few converts to Christianity were either opportunists or had been forced into it. One story that's passed down from the domains of the daimyo Konishi Yukinaga illustrates this nicely. Konishi had ordered his subjects to convert when he did, and most complied but superficially. The conversion was accompanied by the destruction of Buddhist and Shinto religious icons, but in one of Konishi's villages, an old woman hung onto a Buddhist image and kept it in a small shrine in her home. This was then uncovered by a dojuku, a lay Japanese operative at the church who confiscated and destroyed the item, and then reported the woman and her fellow villagers, who he said had largely returned to Buddhism, to the regional governor. That governor in turn began a plan to punish the whole village for violating the Lord's decree by returning to Buddhism. He was stopped only by the direct intervention of the Jesuits, who pled for mercy for the villagers, but not too much mercy. According to the Jesuit historian Louis Froy, quote, "So that the governors could put up some demonstration of justice, they publicly ordered that the house of the old lady be burnt, saying that they pardoned the others on account of their love for the father who'd implored so persistently on their behalf, owing to which they were all terrified from then onwards and very obedient toward the church." The story of the old lady illustrates the ways in which these kinds of conversions could be very ephemeral, both out of a lack of understanding that Christianity was an exclusive religion, neither Buddhism nor Shinto precluded engagement with other religions in most contexts, and because, of course, given what happened to that old lady, it's hard to imagine that most of these conversions were actually genuine from this point forward, as opposed to just something you did because you didn't want your house burned down. I don't want to minimize that there were Japanese converts who were true believers, But it's also not hard to imagine that there were a lot of hangers on of convenience who would jump ship given the chance. The biggest issue for Japan's Christians, though, was that the faith ended up drawing the enmity of some of the most important people in Japanese history: Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu. These are, of course, the second and third, respectively, of the so called reunifiers of Japan, the warlords who brought an end to the civil wars between the samurai clans. Hideyoshi, in particular, brought Kyushu, home to Nagasaki and most of Japan's Christian population, under his control during a military campaign in 1587. That campaign actually had been requested by a Christian daimyo, Otomo Sorin, because he was losing a war against the neighboring Shimazu clan. Otomo had sent a Jesuit friar, Jaspar Coelho, to act as his envoy to Hideyoshi and plead for help. Coelho actually almost got assassinated by Shimazu clan assassins before he even made it to Hideyoshi. So, Hideyoshi was literally invited into Kyushu by a Christian, but even so, he apparently didn't like what he saw there, because the very same year he invaded Kyushu to help Otomo Sorin, in return for which he expected the Otomo to thank him by submitting to his rule, Hideyoshi issued an edict banning Christianity and ordering foreign priests out of Japan. Hideyoshi was also pretty open about why he did this. In a letter to a Portuguese merchant the next year, he plainly said that, quote, "Inasmuch as the fathers preached a law so hostile to the kami, the gods, and Buddhas of Japan, I was constrained to banish them." And Hideyoshi doesn't mean hostile here in the sense of spiritual competition. Jesuits consistently directed their followers to literally smash Shinto and Buddhist temples in territories that had converted, and sometimes even in places that had not yet done so. The first Christian daimyo, Omura Sumitada, nearly got overthrown in a big civil war triggered by the Jesuits when, under their direction, he destroyed his adoptive father's Buddhist memorial tablet, an act of extreme sacrilege and disrespect. Hideyoshi's whole brand was that he was the man who brought order, so he was never going to be a big fan of a religion that openly promoted what he saw as civil disorder. Of course, he may have had other reasons too. The Jesuits had become very used to being in a position of power by this point, and Jaspar Coelho in particular acted in a manner around Hideyoshi that probably came off as very crude and arrogant. He pretty openly tried to bargain with Hideyoshi for something that caught the warlord's interest, a Portuguese warship that Hideyoshi asked for a tour of, in exchange for more land around Nagasaki being given over to the Jesuits. That's a very crass way to act in a society where the norm is way more that you would give a gift of that ship, and then Hideyoshi would give you a gift of something back. Simply demanding a straight-up trade comes off as very arrogant. It also didn't help the Jesuits were intimately involved in the trade in Japanese slaves captured during the civil wars in Kyushu. Those slaves were taken to Nagasaki and then sold throughout the Portuguese Empire. Hideyoshi didn't have a moral objection to slavery, of course. He literally murdered more than a few children during his rise to power. He was not a good person. But he felt that Japanese people being held as slaves reflected poorly on the prestige of Japan, and thus poorly on him. The Jesuits were big facilitators of the slave trade, as indeed many Catholic priests were for the slave trade around the world. Oh, and the Jesuits were also arms dealers for a lot of the local warlords that Hideyoshi now needed to keep under his control and as lightly armed as possible so they wouldn't rebel. So, yeah, not a big fan. Hideyoshi never harshly enforced his expulsion edicts and did tacitly tolerate the continuation of Christianity and the foreign Jesuit presence, so long as it was not too brazen or open. He was worried about losing access to Portuguese merchants and the lucrative China trade they provided, because controlling it made him very rich and gave him a favor that he could hand out to his followers. Priests could not operate openly or minister to the Japanese population, though Hideyoshi's representatives in Nagasaki proved eminently bribable to look the other way, but priests could just take their vestments off and blend into the broader Portuguese population of merchants and sailors pretty easily, and so they were able to still operate. But Hideyoshi was, as a result, not terribly popular among Japanese Christians, and one imagines many of them breathed a sigh of relief when he finally died in 1598. Fighting broke out again shortly thereafter. Hideyoshi's 5-year-old son was not equal to stopping it, and that fighting put Tokugawa Ieyasu in charge by the end of 1600. Doubtless, many Christians hoped the new boss would be more reasonable than the old boss. It turned out, of course, that they were very, very wrong. Ieyasu would maintain Hideyoshi's policies for many years, but in 1609, a particularly abrasive Portuguese captain for that year's trade mission, André Pessoa, would fall afoul of Ieyasu by breaking the rules of his new government, rules that gave the Tokugawa family first pick of the goods the Portuguese brought in. Pessoa didn't like that. He wanted to sell on the open market and make more money. Ieyasu responded to that defiance with the calm and reasoned generosity for which he is known, by which, of course, I mean he ordered his vassals to blow up Pessoa's ship with him on it, as a reminder to the next captain of who gave the orders around these parts. The Pessoa incident made Ieyasu much more suspicious of Christianity and the Portuguese. We also needed less by this point for access to Chinese and European goods, because their rivals, the Dutch and English, had made it to Asia by this point and were more than happy to sell. News had also made it to Japan of the role the church was now playing in the Spanish and Portuguese conquests of the Americas, which made Ieyasu understandably pretty suspicious of the link between the church and Catholic Empire, and about the loyalty of high-ranking Christians in his own ranks, who he suspected might turn on him if the church ordered them to do so. The nature of Christianity itself also bothered Ieyasu. In a 1613 letter from a senior Japanese Christian in Kyoto back to Nagasaki, it says that, quote, the king, in other words Ieyasu, has said that a religion that teaches the adoration of a breaker of the laws of the realm is inspired by the devil and a great crime, which worries me very much. And from Ieyasu's perspective, that makes sense. Jesus was killed for breaking the law. What kind of message did it send to the impressionable masses to say that that person was the savior of humanity? By the next year, Ieyasu had had enough. He drafted an order banning Christianity, expelling all missionaries, closing all churches, and ordering Japanese converts apostatize or die. Unlike Hideyoshi, he was not going to look the other way. It took decades, well past the time of Ieyasu's own death, and a lot of brutal violence to bring about compliance. In Nagasaki, inspectors literally went door to door at one point to demand apostasy, and families that didn't comply were boarded up inside their homes and left to starve. Particularly non-compliant people were taken to sulfur pits outside the city and left to pass out from the fumes, only to be revived over and over until they cracked. Public executions were not uncommon. At first, Christians resisted, but the most resistant died and the others gave up. Christianity had largely vanished from Japan by the late 1630s, outside of a few holdout Christian communities in the most remote parts of Japan that were able to disguise their faith successfully and last all the way to the mid-1800s when they rejoined the mainstream church. Now, the biggest thing I want to point out here is that Christianity is actually not the only religion that drew the ire of Japan's reunifiers. Indeed, arguably, one of the biggest driving factors behind the civil wars in the 1500s was the amount of political, economic, and even military power that a lot of religious institutions held, which made it hard for the government to control them. There are a lot of examples, but just to give one, the Jodo Shinshu, or True Pure Land sect of Buddhism, was hugely influential in the 1500s. Its radically egalitarian message that anyone could gain enlightenment through the veneration of the Buddha Amida was hugely popular among the lower and middle classes, arguably in a way very similar to how early Christianity won over the lower classes of the Roman Empire. Armed Jodo Shinshu followers calling themselves Ikko Ikki, single-minded leagues, were able to seize control of big chunks of Japan and eject the local daimyo or feudal lords from power. It took decades of brutal campaigning, particularly on the parts of the first two unifiers, Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, to bring the power of Jodo Shinshu under control. But this is the interesting thing. Despite being a threat to the power of Japan's new rulers, arguably a much more direct one than Christianity ever was, Jodo Shinshu was never subject to the same level of crackdown that Christianity was. The Tokugawa shoguns issued edicts dividing the sect in two, with two separate head temples, Nishi and Higashi Honganji, set up in Kyoto to manage that division to weaken the power of the sect. And of course, the temples were never allowed to possess the level of wealth and power they once had when their followers had directly controlled big chunks of territory in central Japan. But beyond the violence that had been required to bring the temples under control in the first place, followers were not subject to persecution, and Jodo Shinshu temples even enjoyed government sponsorship under Tokugawa rule. The contrast with Christianity could not be more marked. There was never any consideration of dividing it into Eastern and Western Christianity and bringing the sect more under the control of the shogun. And this lends a lot of credibility to the idea that what drove the persecution of Christians in particular were concerns about their loyalty to outside powers and the ways in which the theology of Christianity encouraged disobedience against the government. And here at long last, we return to the idea of conspiracism, well behind the schedule, of course, of where I'd expected to be in my planning of this miniseries. I am nothing if not consistent, but next week we will see why all this history about Christianity matters. Because even though Christianity itself was basically gone from Japan by the mid-1600s, the idea of Christianity as a subversive, almost magically evil element in society remained quite powerful. Arguably, it got more powerful the further we get from the living memory of actual Christians in Japan. The idea of secret Christian cabals conspiring to undercut social order and spread their evil religion, which is what the government did call it, to destroy Japan from within, was such a source of profound paranoia that fear of Christians remained powerful throughout the 250 years of the Tokugawa shogunate. In a word, Christianity became a focus of conspiracist thinking, and we'll see next week what that kind of pre-modern conspiracy theory looks like. For now, though, that's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network on Patreon. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for part 3, after which we will take a brief break. We'll be 1 week off, and then pick up the series from there.